How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Elvira Gonzalez here, and today let's going to continue explore about the React, the joy of React, or to dive deep into the React, which is a course taught by Josh Comeo, a software engineer that has previously worked at Khan Academy as well as Gatsby, and now he create his own academy, his online academy, right? Where he teach stuff like CSS as well as the React, which is this course, the joy of React. So despite that we already have quite a lot of experience with React, all right, and then we know how to build React applications from scratch, and also how you can develop now more how you can develop scalable web applications with React. That's what most of the time you are gonna be hired to work on a particular company that helps them to fix some bugs and or identify is some optimization bottlenecks, or to create some or to enhance is the user experience, fix some bugs and that kind of stuff, right? As well as to help them to design new products, new features, because that's the value of all of this, right? That's the entire reason why a lot of people actually use now React to build products, web app products, because of that. And if you want to have a true understanding of how this tool works, that's why we went through this particular course. And prior to this, there is another course from the CSS for developers, where in that course, this is also from Josh Comeu, sorry, we went through, explain briefly, is the fundamentals, the model zero, the fundamental of CSS, and how that now is tightly coupling, or is highly related to this particular course. So in that course, we look at what is the CSS, what are the way of how you can add style to your CSS, whether it's external files or external style sheet or internal style sheet or inline, how you can select elements, also via combinators, and also as well as state base, all right. And how we look at the functions, which is another part of the anatomy of the CSS, such as math, HSL, color, and math is not, is calc, as well as translate, in some of the add rules, which is CSS behaviors, or you tell now how your CSS should behave. So for example, with media, with view transitions, with layers, with import. So you are telling now to CSS how to behave, as well as keyframe, and also the property shorthands and the comments. So we make a quick recap, or we did a quick recap of that particular model, which is looking first at the most common things that we need to know that are still relevant in modern web development. So first thing first is to understand is the anatomy of the CSS, which is what is a rule, selector, a declaration, the values, all right. And understand also is the media query, why it is useful media query, the selectors, so the most common selectors, such as the direct descendant, and also the pseudo classes selectors, such as, which is state base, right? they're going to be applied that rules based on a particular state. If that state occurs, this is the rule that is going to apply. So we get this, which is the hover, the focus. Why we care about especially focus, since focus is something that is used for the accessibility, the guidelines for accessibility, the WCAG 2.1, which stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It has principles that aims to provide accessibility to your websites. So this is made of 4 principles. So you have now the perceivable. It stands for POUR, P-O-U-R. I think that's a bad acronym, but in any case. So perceivable, it is operable, it is understandable, and if that is robust, right? So focus fits in one of those principles, specifically the understandable, all right, or how you can navigate your website without using any point-like pointers, all right, and also how we look at the other pseudo classes, such as the such as the check, which is also important. So check, the first and last child, the first and last end type, all right, and the subtle difference between them. So the first actually is checked if that selector actually match with as the first element, or as the first child. If it's not, well, it's not going to apply that rule. Whereas the first or the last end child is actually going to look at that selector and match that to apply the rules. Now, also the pseudo elements. So for example, like placeholder and the before and after, and other, for example, the combinators, the direct ancestors, next to civilian, and how do we handle with colors? All right, what is color? Some of the 4 formats in color in CSS. So we have a keyword for educational purpose, the hexadecimal, the RGB to improve the readability of the color. But if you want to get now some nuanced color, HSL is the way to go in that regard. Now, why this is important? Okay, because with HSL is something that we're gonna see a lot of the time in other models when we want is to tweak the color to get now a specific nuance color, right? So HSL stands for hue, which is a ring like that go from 0 to 3060, which is a ring of color. Then you have the L and S, which is light, the saturation, which tells the how gray out or vibrant this color, and the other is the lightness, right? So with lightness, we can now at 50% is indicate that this is a true color. So far so good, because with that, all right, with that, now we know this particular format. Again, we're just looking at the fundamentals, and then we also look at the unit, the M, root M, or RM, or rem, and percentage, which is one of them. Why we look at percentage is why this is useful for things that we're gonna see that later, which is the height and the aspect ratio for image, Okay, and then the typography, which is again is another realm in itself to describe here all of the graphemes and the glyph in a particular alphabet. But this is the fundamentals. So we care about is first understanding what is the font family, which is a multi-character set that, for example, in the case of Roboto, you have now 6 characters, 6 type of 6 variant, or I mean this is 6 font weight, all right, and then the 2 for text formatting, but there is normal and italic, right? So because most of the time this font family, the browsers which is stand on the OS come up with all of these different things like the the different things like the did I lose my mind? So fonts here, all right. Also, the OS come with all of these different OS. Okay, now because these fonts are provided by default by the OS, so now the browser can use them. So, for example, Tahoma, Times New Romans, Arial, right? Most of the time applications wants to provide a unique experience to this, and the way to do that is by creating their own fonts. So for example, Airbnb created its own it made its own in-house font known as Celerial, right? So why this is important? Because as we look at this web fonts, which is the name of this personalized or this custom in-house development font, okay, so by exploring is that how you can provide formatting how you can now use the text format, for example, like bold for important things or italic for any time that you have an in-person conversation. There is a lot of non-verbal clue that happens. So here this allows to describe is some of them. So for example, when you quote stuff, you use now italic. When a character is now thinking, we use italic. So for example, there are some mentions about the TV or books, that kind of stuff, we use italic. Or when some scientific name is mentioned, we use italic. All right. And the text underlined to indicate that this is now a particularly anchor tag or anchor link. Okay. And well, some semantics tag such as M and strong, and why we need to use that to provide more hints to these assistive technologies. Also, how you can align the text, how you can is using the value for that text align, how you can now provide spacing between letter spacings or between lines, line height, as well as the text transformation that can be applied. So for example, uppercase, lowercase, and also some tips, helpful tips for your CSS. All of this is just to recap these fundamentals, all right, of CSS, which is the anatomy of the CSS rule, as well as these some additional classes or important topic like media, selectors, pseudo classes, and pseudo select, and pseudo elements, the combinators, the color unit, as well as text and typography. All right. So once we went through this in React, is to understand that, well, now once we are going to, as you go through this, if we want to understand now the fundamental of React, okay, the model 0, we first look at what is the benefit of this by describing the problem that made this tool be possible to be created, which is with Facebook. There is a particularly, and I think this is quite important, at least for the historical purpose, historical reasons here. Some of you might want to skip this because this is quite annoying and boring. Most of the time you don't want to know. The TLDR is that they have is a notification panel, so the users were complaining because anytime that they click on their notifications, okay, they click that, and what happened is, well, they are getting is they're not getting any new message. And the thing here is that because the notification, the message drawer, the widget, and the main view, because each one of those were views that were out of sync of the state, there was an issue, because anytime that they are trying to fix a particular specific problem, this actually come up again, and they, well, fix that. Then now another way, so they need to implement a new features, and this problem appears again, and you can think of this like a guacamole game. All right, so there was an experimental feature called React that say, hey, I will sync the state of your application. I will keep the state of your application and the UI sync. And this is the power of the React, or the magic of the React, which is something that we give now by selling a lot of these frameworks, the front-end frameworks that we have right now, right? Like especially in Vue and Svelte. Now, the point of this is to look at how can we use now React to see how can we start to building our elements or UI elements, and from there now create our own React. And the way to do that is by, well, simply get this object, all right, and from this object, which is now have the same shape as the React create elements, all right, I want you to replicate that behavior, or in other words, take all of this information, create now this new tag using the document.create, and therefore now return that, so we can append that chunks of data or that chunk of that element into the DOM. So if you can imagine that the more elements you want to append, the more tedious it becomes to write this, not even to read that. So we make a quick pause here to understand now a little bit of the React 19 versions, where this is saying, hey, this React 19 is, you can think of, or it can be boiled down into three buckets, right? So minor change to improve now how you interact with the stability of the server component, as well as the introduction to the Actions API. So that was great and cool, right? So most of the time, this is still features that are not being well adopted for the community. So right now we are more in a, we'll see, we'll wait and see, right? We'll wait and see. Now, because creating these single elements or these HTML tags especially if you want to render a list of elements, or if you want to create and bundle and create much more complex applications, right? So there is now particularly markup language, which stands for JSX, which what it does is to allow us to write is this in a HTML-ish syntax like, right? Where we look at the at what the JSX is doing, the difference, which is a transpiler, the difference between a transpiler and a compiler. The transpiler help you to now is transform high-level code or high-level code into one language into another high-level language, from Python to JavaScript to Python or Go or Rust. Whereas a compiler is allows to transform is this high-level language into machine code. We can use the term compile here. We know the difference, but we use that in the sense of transforming from one language to another. Now, this transpiler, all right, or this JSX, specifically this JSX, the syntax-like, the HTML syntax-like, we look at the because this must be this exactly. We look at the common features, all right, like expressions, JSX expressions, and how you can now is inject here some JavaScript expressions, the difference between expression and a statement. Some couple examples of that. We're not going to dive deep into that, as well as the TLDR of this is a statement produces an action where an expression produces a value. All right. So we look at the how you can attach attributes. Or attribute expressions, the type, coercion, and comment. And then now the difference, all right, between the JSX and the HTML. We'll first look at the reserved keywords, all right, that is the HTML4, the for, the class, where now they change that. For example, HTML4 is for labels. The class name is the way how you can now define class, like the HTML. The self-closing tags, the case-sensitive tags, the case-sensitive attributes, all right? The inline style that when you now inject into JSX is an object, you are effectively creating as an object with the attributes set in a specific way, right? Or inline style here. And what are the most common attributes in the inline style attributes that you might encounter for the format of that, and some of the corner cases when you want to deal with this style, inline style creation, right? So this inline style creation is like, for example, so background color. So the C of color actually is in this uppercase. So for example, tab index, stroke dash array is another one. So yeah, so tabs index strike is another one. There's some other cases that are not relevant. So for example, like data and area, you don't care about any of that. All right. And yeah, and okay. And then, all right, we look at very interesting cases here, right? Interesting cases. Exactly, let me put it this. interesting cases like the tag when it's being used, why do we need to use that, and the white space gotcha, that if you want to, for example, add some space to that, remember that behind the scenes what you're doing is to creating is for each one of those HTML tag is now a React create element. Okay, and given you pass now the tag, and you pass also the attributes that that tag will have, as well as the content that can be have several children's or just ones or just content. So with that, and then once we compare the JSX versus the template, okay, and how now they are not the same, since now JSX, unlike a template, is not creating its own specific syntax for covering its conditions and looping. No. JSX, in fact, what it's doing is to convert HTML into JavaScript, and all the logic is being handled it's being handled by JavaScript, and that's is the difference here, unlike template engines such as Blade or Liquid for Ruby. All right. That's the subtle difference here. So the template language turned the markup you write into HTML, and this means that they need to invent this custom mini language which it is own logic and dynamic things, since HTML doesn't have any of this. So JSX, on the other hand, it turns out this into JavaScript code, and all the logic is being solved at that level, at the JavaScript level. So that's where we can use or reuse methods like filter, slides, and reduce. And I think that was very, very, very eye-opening when we find that out. So, because we can take notes of this course, and I can record the screen. I actually asked permission to Josh to do that. So here we go. Components. Finally. Finally, good. So components are a huge part of React. If you only know one thing about React, you probably know that this is a components-based framework. So what is a component exactly? A component, to me, let me give you my definition of a component in this context, and then I'm gonna read that. So a component is, in the web development, is the way of how you can now have is JavaScript, CSS, and HTML to build now a user interface. Again, in this context, this is the idea of components, right? That you have now a small unit of you have now a small piece of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to compose them into one single user interface. All right. So here's how I like to define them. A component is a bundle of markup, styles, and logic that controls everything about a specific part of the user interface. So this was exactly what it is. So, but it go now deep dive into this. So a component is a build of the markup, the structure, the style, and the logic. All right. That control everything for a specific user interface. So it is a different mental model when it comes to code organizations, of course, because typically we separate this topics, all right, or markups, we typically separate is the structure with the structure, the style with the style, and the JavaScript with the JavaScript, right? But because here the idea is to now mix this structure, the style, and the logic inside of a one bundle, that control everything inside of that specific user interface. This is a completely different mental model of how do we separate concerns. So now the separation of concerns traditionally has been like this. Credit for the wonderful image that goes to Cristiano Rastelli. That's interesting. Design system lead HashiCorp. Uh-huh. In love with atomic design system, and CSS architecture. Absolutely, man. Design system. Attendee speaker organizing or of tech conference and meetups. Dido.net. Dido.net. What the French stuff is this? Growing as an IC contributor. Recently, I was part of the panel for the Design No Site, a 3-day virtual event by the Design Org in HashiCorp. The session was about career growth, and I was asked to share my experience as an individual contributor, engineer. So I started to jot down some ideas in a Google Doc when a stream of consciousness started, and my self-reflection, not sure why, took a shape of a self-interview. Anyway, this belongs is a mix-up of what came out of this exercise and actual answering questions of this. Archive. Goodbye, Badu and Bubble. Status quo. My takes on writing good comment. Design talking beyond colors. Typography and spacing. Memo refactoring, not on the backlog. Measuring the impact of assistant design. Measuring the impact of assistant design. Bottom input tool model. Oh, because they are on the system design. New Year's non-resolution for 2019. Generating multi-brand, multi-platform icons with Sketch and Node.js script. Generating multi-brand, and here how to manage your design token. Keep it simple, stupid. Technical debt is equipped. Autobiography is in 5 short chapters. From Zero to Cosmos. 2018. Missed opportunities. A non-zero game. Okay, yeah, exactly. Systematics, the first rule to reduce technical debt. Big data, intelligence, artificial connaissance, classes and ID aren't owned by CSS. New Year's resolution, algorithm, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and us designer. In 2016, Brexit, things are easy. Holy moly. Interesting. The impact of code in society, industry conference, diversity in tech. We are getting there. And hello, Badu. Holy moly. They hire you for that? My first one in Badu, a social network of nearly 300 million people active in 190 countries. Badu, bro, goddamn. Lol. Badu. Ah, I get it. Oh my god, I get it. I get it, I get it. I get it. What? 2016. Exactly. And then he say goodbye, Babu, Badu, and Bubble. After 5.5 years, today is MetLife. Today is working at Babu, formerly Magic Lab, formerly Badu. Bombly. Okay. They are pivoting. They are pivoting. That's what happened. That's what happened. Is a lot of these companies are pivoting. They're pivot. They are pivoting. It's been a long time for my standard, and this is big volume about how much I love working with Badu and Bumble. And I am leaving behind a bunch of super uber smart people, unforgettable moments, and really good memories. I'm not being an easy decision. This company has given so much in terms of professional growth, but I am confident I am leaving what we have built together is capable. When I joined the company at this time, it was in Badu. I was part of the relatively small team, the mobile web team. I was like a family, and we really made wave. Everyone agreed we were the best team in the company. Sorry, folks, but I don't make the rules. So is this? This is it. That's right. I was hired as a UI engineer, and at the time, for some reason, HTML, CSS developers were not allowed to touch JavaScript code, and JavaScript developers were not allowed to touch HTML, CSS code. And I have to deal with every possible mobile browser on any possible mobile device. Believe me when I say it was fun. Okay. Alright, well, from there, things got better and better. In a few months, I started to work on a style line for UI components for a mobile web app, and in no time, this became a fully fledged multi-product, multi-platform design system called Cosmos. Exactly, they create their own design system called Cosmos. I have written extensively about it in a series of Medium blogs, so if you want to know more about it, there is a plenty to read. From zero to Cosmos. Okay, as a way to create now this rising action, crisis, climax, denouement, end. So under the radar, all of this layout. Okay, so this is now creating is, okay, creating all of this. Mm-hmm. In Bumble. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. In Bumble Tech. Scaling iOS 3 resolves developer of quality life. Universal link for Android iOS. hmm But what about? Well, this is the Bumble Tech. Okay, that's interesting. Written by Cristiano Rastelli. Growing as an individual contributor, which is what something that we looked back then. Ah, okay. A career with a design system. Viewport industry. Side project. Speaking conference and teaching workshops. Google Fund Knowledge. Google Fund Knowledge. Side project Universal Principle of Typography. Hello Type Friends. Adobe Fonts again. Type specific design. Uh-huh. Okay, Orion Management. Okay, okay. Okay, here we are reading is this the word here. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. They are not your family. They don't care about you. Despite what they say, they will lay you off within second thoughts if they need to. You should have a similar relation towards them. Again, they are not your family. They pay you to do a job. It is a business relationship based on a contract. Do it to the best for your abilities, but don't burn yourself out of them. Don't sacrifice yourself, your family, your loved one, your life. So look at the compensation as an integral part of the contract. Think, fuck, you pay me, good fellas. If this makes things easy for you, the good fella was a great
The
movie.
guy's got Paulie as a partner. Any problems, he goes to Paulie. Trouble with the bill, he can go to Paulie. Trouble with the cops, deliveries, Tommy, he can call Paulie. But now the guy's got to come up with Paulie's money every week, no matter what. Business bad? Fuck you, pay me. Oh, you had a fire? Fuck you, pay me. Place got hit.
Exactly, 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 exactly.
Week, no matter what. Business, deliveries, Tommy, he can call Paulie. But now the guy's got to come up with Paulie's money every week, no matter what. Business bad? Fuck you, pay me. Oh, you had a fire? Fuck you, pay me.
Oh, you had a fire? Fuck you, baby.
Place got hit by lightning, huh? Fuck you, pay me.
What if I get one of those TVs?
Nah, I'll be sorry.
Exactly, because that's the idea behind this, you know? That's the idea behind this. If this makes things easy for you, you are in a business relationship with your employer. You have the right to be paid in relation to your abilities and skill and what you can bring to the table. Do you remember the confidence and self-belief I was talking about a moment ago? Well, the one is important, no, even better, necessary when it comes to money. So don't be afraid of talking about your compensation of your next promotion with your manager, with your skip level. I know it can be uncomfortable, but guess what? It is also part of the job. Yes, discussing your compensation, your promotion is part of your job. It may be difficult, but this should be part of your skills, your professional toolbox. Learn little by little how to get out of the comfort zone and have the critical conversations. Again, grow up professionally. Prepare your discussion points ahead of time, possible in a shared document. Clearly communicate what are your career aspirations, the projects you like to be involved in, and yes, your expectation in terms of salary and promotion. Use your manager's insight into the company's direction to align your personal goals with the company objective. In this way, you can ensure you move in the same direction. And the more aligned you are, the more valuable you are. That's completely, man. Most importantly, highlight your success. Learn to sell yourself. And ask for the support you need to succeed. Last, maybe a bit thorny question. Did you ever consider moving into a more managerial role? Let me rephrase it for you. You have been in this industry for 30 plus years and you still are an independent contributor. Why? Well, the answer is as the same before. I still love the work that I do passionately. I still find it so intellectually, personally, and professionally fulfilled. I still wake up every morning and I'm happy to sit down, open my laptop, and start to work. I'm so lucky to privileged to be able to do the job that I am love doing instead of a job that I have to do. I can't stress enough how lucky I am compared to millions of people who hate their job but they can change it or quit because they have to put food on the table or take care of others, or don't have other choice. The IC position tends to come with a lot of independent and agency. You can take ownership of complex projects and solve them with a great deal of autonomy. That's what I like the most about my job, to be honest. Being a manager is a completely different job. It's not a career upgrade. It is not moving up. It is a sideways move. It is a completely new career. And while I really appreciate the complexity and the challenge offered by working as manager of people, of product, projects, and companies, and potentially the fulfillment and success that come with doing this work well, in reality, it's never appealed to me as a career. I don't know why, but that's how my brain works. Plus, dealing with people with all their idiosyncrasies instead of working with binary logic, which is quite predictable, well, it is much harder. It requires a lot of soft skill that I don't have. I don't have any more the energy or will to cultivate. Sorry. Yes, of course. I always ask myself, do you really see yourself writing code when you are 65? Uh, pff, things change, bro. Things change, and I will evolve with it. Do you ever think of the risk of becoming an all obsolete developer? But the answer I gave myself is not that the solution is to become a manager. It's never been the answer to me. I just live day by day, month by month, year by year of profession every day, discovering that I still have it and that I was still having an impact in the work I was doing, that I was still growing. Personally, I will hope that in few years' time I can completely change this field of work. I think we all can agree that the IT industry is not anymore in its golden age. If there was ever one more of the dark age, to be honest, or maybe do something completely different. Woodworking? Why not surprise? This doesn't mean that I don't think people should look or becoming manager. On the contrary, you can imagine a workplace with no manager and no server. But remaining an independent contributor, you are de facto limited the extent of impact that you can have. If you instead manage a team or even multiple teams, your impact is multiplied by a large factor. The higher your level is in the company, the bigger the impact you can have on the product you work, on the community where you operate, on the field of the industry you are in. You can even change the world if you're lucky. It is really hard to change the world if you are an AC. My advice about the whole IC versus manager question is do what you like, right? So if you are curious about becoming a manager, it is something that you want to explore, it is something that emphasizes you. You see yourself leading a team, multiple team, or entire company, don't hesitate, jump on it, do it with passion, energy, da, da, da. And if you discover they don't that you don't like it, well, you can always go back to being an independent contributor. It happened to me in some ways. In HashiCorp, I joined as a team lead, but with time, I have moved back to a more independent contributor like role. And it happened to a lot of people that I know personally. They too follow their passion, what they like to do, and you know what? They were happy again. And they're still growing as independent contributors every day, also in terms of remuneration. In my experience, being an independent contributor has always been a viable choice, something I love to do and well remunerated too. As they say, funny job, exactly. So independent contributor. That's interesting. That's interesting. Independent contributor. Okay. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Okay. Hmm. Mm-hmm. 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 That's interesting. That's interesting. But in any case, okay. Okay. Hmm. It was a good gym. This was a good gym. By the way. This was a good gym, by the way. Almost a year, by the way. Almost a year, by the way. Hmm. Very, very interesting. Interesting. Hmm. You know, this is the progression. The progression of senior front-end engineer is that they're going to become now design system engineers. Because at the end of the day, you need to create, you need to design this. That's the progression that I'm seeing right now. Because this is where you need, this is where you can provide the most out of it. This is where you can provide the most out of it. Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Taskify. Oh, so they renamed themselves. You know, they pivoted. They pivot, they pivot, they pivot, they pivot. Now they don't call that. It's now Taskify. It's now Taskify. Taskify. Okay. Yeah, it's bench. It's benching. It's benching. A lot of this is benching. A lot of this is benching. So that was quite interesting. Very, very interesting, by the way. Very, very, very interesting. This is in 2023. This is in 2023, bro. Okay. In HashiCorp. Do Cloud right. In San Francisco, of course. The risk of cybersecurity tools sprawl and why we need consolidation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is holy moly. This is the reason why they're asking is for you to be a system design. And the reason why I'm actually dive deep into this particular concept. Alright? Let's get into this. Let's definitely get into this. Definitely get into this. Which is the components, right? Components. Exactly. The components here. So, what is a component? Okay? In the context of the web is a bill, as I mentioned here, is a bundle. Exactly, it's a bundle. It's a bundle of structure, style, and logic for a specific user interface. Okay? It's for that. So in the context of the web, it's a bundle of structure, style, and logic that controls a specific user interface. All right. So it is a different mental model when it comes to code organization. Instead of separating our application for markup, right? Now we're going to organize this by components. So there is a lovely graphic, I think, that illustrates this really well. Okay. I'm gonna make this graphic here. But why am I doing this? Because the whole point of this is that you need to be able to describe what you're doing and how you do it and why you're doing it. That's the only reason why am I doing this. And especially if you need to explain that or to try to convince somebody, right? Some investors, yada yada yada, you know. But again, if you're going to explain that to somebody, it's like that. Imagine that you're going to explain that to your son, okay, to a kid. So the more eloquent or the more simple you are to explain something, the better off will be for you. Now, this is the mechanism of reuse. So traditionally, HTML doesn't really have a way to reuse chunks of markup. Many languages will use partials to achieve this. A partial is a chunk of HTML that can be inserted into another HTML document. In CSS, the main mechanism we have to reuse is a class. Okay, mechanism of reuse. Interesting. Traditionally, HTML doesn't really have a way to reuse chunks of markup. Many languages use partials to achieve this. A partial is a chunk of HTML that can be inserted into another HTML document. In CSS, the main mechanism we have for reuse is a class. For example, we might create this standard button style with this. Whenever we apply this set of style or these rules to an HTML element, we can pop the button class onto it, and the JavaScript mechanism for reuse is the function. Maybe we have a function to process data in some days. All right, so return sentence to uppercase plus this one, right? So shut up. We're off to see the wizard. We're off to see the wizard. With React, components are the main mechanism of reuse. With Vue, SFC are the main components to reuse. This is true for user interface. All right, this is true for user interface. Instead of partial for HTML classes for CSS and functions for JavaScript, we create components that bundles all the three and allow us to create libraries of high-level reusable user elements. This idea is really very powerful. It takes a while to get accustomed to thinking in components, but once you do, you will never want to work on a project without them. Modern React also features hook, which is offer a mechanism of reuse React logic, similar to the composition API. Oh my God, this is okay. I really love about this because this is conceptually. Once you mechanism of reuse. All right, mechanism of reuse. All right, let me pause here. I'll be right back. And we're back. I really love about this topic, this concept here of the mechanism of reuse, right? Because here you can see not only is this high level concept, all right, that you can replicate to any other framework that you want to use, right? Which is gonna give you is a much better sense of what this is all about. So mechanism of reuse, all right. So traditionally HTML doesn't really have a way to reuse chunks of markup. Doesn't really have a way to reuse chunks of markups. All right, so many languages will use partials to achieve this. So many language will use partials to achieve this. All right. in HTML. In CSS, the main mechanism we reuse is the class. In CSS, the main mechanism we reuse is class, right? Okay, I discovered that. Okay. Is class. All right. So for example, in a bottom. So for example, we might create a standard bottom here. Under the bottom class, right? So is this. All right. It makes a lot of sense. Whenever we want to apply this set of styles to an HTML element, you can pop the bottom class onto it. Okay. In JavaScript, the main reuse mechanism is the function. Okay. Is the function. All right. So for example, like this. So we got is this. In React. Okay. In React, the main mechanism to reuse is the components, or specifically the React components. Okay. Which is a bundle between, all right, which is a bundle between HTML, CSS, particularly is JSX. Exactly. It's a bundle between JSX, CSS, we can combine all of this, which is a bundle between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Okay. We can create a component that bundles all the up three, right? So the main mechanism to reuse is the components, which is a bundle between, which is a bundle of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? HTML partials, CSS class, and JavaScript functions. It is also important to know that modern React also features hooks, which is the way hooks, all right? So hooks So yeah. So is the mechanism to reuse React logic here. All right, something that we're going to see that later. So thinking in components.
So a few years ago, I used to teach at a local coding bootcamp, and right when we were starting to learn React, I loved to do this activity, where I would pull up some sort of design or mock-up, and as a group, we would essentially vandalize it. We would try to figure out if we were in charge of implementing this, as a group, we would essentially vandalize it. And right when we were starting to learn React, I loved to do this activity, where I would pull up some sort of design or mock-up, and as a group, we would essentially vandalize it. We would try to figure out if we were in charge of implementing this, because that's how it works. You get a static file, and your job is to turn it into a live web application. And one of the first steps in that is figuring out which elements should be components and how the whole thing should be architected. And I love doing this early, before you feel like you really know how to do it, because it's a really good way to start training your mind to think in the right paradigm. Especially if you're not used to components, if you're coming from like a template-based language, I find this exercise super, super helpful. So we're going to do a modified version of that. And the way that it works is you'll be shown a mockup like this, the Google homepage, and essentially asked to draw boxes around every element that you think should be its own component. So maybe I decide this logo should be its own component. You can draw a box by clicking and dragging, and then this modal pops up and asks you to give it a name. So I'm going to call this logo. It's conventional in React to name your components in this like smushed together camel case with a first capital letter thing, but really you can name them however you want. There's no sort of enforcement on this activity. But yeah, that's essentially the process, right? You think, okay, maybe I want a search form component that should span all of this, so I'll call it search form. And sometimes you'll see multiple instances of the same component. Like I see 2 buttons over here. So what you can do is you draw a box around the first one, you call it...
Wait, what?
So a few years ago, I used to teach at a local coding bootcamp, and right when we were starting to learn React, I loved to do this activity, where I would pull up some sort of design or mock-up, and as a group, we would essentially vandalize it. We would try to figure out if we were in charge of implementing this, because that's how it works. You get a static file, and your job is to turn it into a live web application. And one of the first steps in that is figuring out which elements should be components and how the whole thing should be architected. And I love doing this early, before you feel like you really know how to do it, because it's a really good way to start training your mind to think in the right paradigm, element that you think should be its own component. Okay. So maybe I decide this logo should be its own component. You can draw a box by clicking and dragging, and then this modal pops up and asks you to give it a name. So I'm going to call this logo. It's conventional in React to name your components in this like smushed together camel case with a first capital letter thing. But really you can name them however you want. There's no sort of enforcement on this activity. But yeah, that's essentially the process, right? You think, okay, maybe I want a search form component that should span all of this, so I'll call it search form. And sometimes you'll see multiple instances of the same component. Like I see 2 buttons over here. So what you can do is you draw a box around the first one, you call it button. When you draw the box around the second one, instead of typing button again, you can pick it from the list and say, okay, this is another instance of button. And that's like a little quality of life thing. Like here's a third button, so I'll do it again. Because the button is the most recent component I've created, I can skip this whole process and just press enter, and it'll automatically create that as a button. Now, to draw boxes like this requires a pointer device and quite a bit of dexterity. So there is an alternate control scheme where if you're using the keyboard to navigate, you can press tab until you see this blue button pop up. When you press enter, you'll notice a little cursor gets added and you can move this around with the arrow keys. It's good to move it to the top left corner of the box you want to draw. Press enter and it expands outwards, and now, instead of moving the box around, the arrow keys will resize the box that you're creating. Press enter again, and now you can name your component, and it's essentially the same process but with the keyboard instead of using a mouse or pointer. When you're satisfied with the boxes you've created, you can submit your work and you'll be shown a video. And in this video, I'll show you my thought process and the boxes that I drew and why. But critically important, this is not a solution video because there's no solution, right? Like all of this stuff is subjective, and even like myself, as I go to actually implement one of these designs as I would in the real world, I'll probably realize that I made some bad assumptions or that I think better of it once you actually get to implementing it. So even what I did probably isn't what I would actually do in a real world project. You sort of have to get your feet wet before you know whether something's a good idea or not.
Absolutely.
So the point isn't to come up with the right answers. The point is to start asking the right questions. What I mean by that is, as you start facing this challenge, you might think, well, how do I determine what should be a component and shouldn't? And if I have these two things that are kind of similar but not really, should they both be the same component or should they be different? How many boxes should I draw? Should I draw boxes inside boxes? How many layers of components should I have? These are questions that we're going to be answering throughout the course. But for now, for this activity, the goal is to start asking the right questions. So I hope you enjoy this. It's meant to be like kind of a leisurely recreational activity. I hope it isn't stressful. I realize that it might be a little stressful because you don't really know what you're doing yet. But please take this with the spirit it's intended as just a way to start getting our toes wet a little bit and start thinking about these things in the right terms.
Oh, it's like PayPal redesign. Okay, thinking in components. Okay, this is a quite interesting here. It's like thinking in components. Especially a couple exercise to do, especially for those who are not familiar with the component-based architecture, right? Which is like this. So draw boxes here. All right. That's when you look at this. So you can say, hey, this will be now a button. This will be now a button. And this will be now a section. Wait, what? Clear boxes. It's like, hey, this will be now name of the component. You're gonna see it's now some card, right? Name of the component. You're gonna see it's now the steps. The steps. The name of the component here you have now is some sort of forms, right? Some sort of forms. And here you have now this a button here. You know, you say a button. And also here the same for that, that's a button. Here you have the payment reference, okay, which is now is like a card, a variation of a card. Similar to this is now a card, and the same for this is an empty card. You keep your card info secure when shopping, which is now an info, you know, some info. And then we have now a button here. And here we got now is a drop down. Now drop down. And here we got is another one, which is the info. right? When you submit, and then now we look at the other elements here, right?
So this is a hypothetical redesign of the PayPal checkout flow. And when I look at this, right, I see that there's this kind of multi-step process. We're moving through the flow. This whole thing is kind of like an old school wizard, if you remember those. So I'm going to start by drawing a box around the entire thing, and I'm going to call it checkout flow. And this component is going to be responsible for adding this decorative right-hand side and for containing the layout and kind of the structure for this whole thing. And for the actual stuff over here, I'm going to break it into 3 chunks. I'm going to have a header called header. I'm going to have a footer, you guessed it, called footer. And then I'll have like a main content area. And maybe I would have this as its own component. Maybe it would just have the individual pieces. I think for now I'll assume that it's sort of, this is the main thing we're dealing with, so I don't need to pull it into its own component. I do see that I have these sort of 3 steps. And presumably, I can click over here to go back to step 1, or click over here to go on to step 3. So I'm going to call this a, let's see, step toggle, because I can toggle between different steps. And each of these components inside is going to be a step. And I think because, like, if I was to click on this first item, then all of this stuff would go away, right? It would be swapped out for whatever the first step contains, like your name and email or whatever. So I'm going to call this payment step, because it's the step where I select my payment method. I see that I have this, so I can toggle between these 2 things. And this to me feels like sort of a low-level primitive, right? It's the sort of thing you could use this exact same component in a bunch of different places. So I'm going to call it toggle. I also see that I have this little help circle. And presumably if I hover over this text or over this icon, I would get a little tooltip explaining what it means by payment preferences. So I'm going to call this whole thing tooltip. Then I'm going to call this cute thing, I'm going to call it credit card mockup. And I'll call this, I guess, add card input. In the footer, well, I see that I have what looks to be a pretty typical button, so I'll call this button. I have this sort of, I don't know, maybe this could be like step indicator. That might be overkill. And then I have this toggle over here, right, this language selector. And this is interesting. On the one hand, it's a select, so maybe I could call this select. It's sort of a pretty primitive, low-level, right? It's really just a select tag that maybe I wrap in some custom styling. But it's also a language select, right? Like if I was to select my language to be from English to French, a bunch of stuff would have to happen. And maybe it would be convenient for us to bundle that logic, the language selecting logic, in its own component. Because I can imagine there might be other places on the PayPal website that I'm able to change my language. So I'm actually going to wrap this first component in a second component called language select. Of course, all of this is subject to change, right? As I'm implementing this, I might realize that some of my boxes don't quite make sense. Again, the goal isn't to come up with the right answer. It's just to start thinking in these ways. And it does bring up some interesting questions. Like with this language toggle, should that be its own component? And how exactly would that work, right? What are the considerations in terms of, do I have components that are only for UI things like buttons and toggles and selects? Or can I have reusable components that exist to serve a more concrete purpose, like changing the language or changing the step? There's some really interesting considerations that we're going to talk about much more throughout the course. For now, though, the goal is to start thinking about these questions.
Exactly. So let's draw a couple boxes here. So let's draw a couple boxes here. So let's draw a couple boxes here. But the idea here is to now look at how he actually made this. So you can see that, hey, this will be now the entry point. Okay. So this will be now the entry point. You can call this as the main content, right? The main content, all right? Where now, as you move on, you can see, hey, this will be now like a logo, right? A logo component, logo component. Here we have now is the search bar, right? We can call this the search bar, right. As you can see inside of this, you can have now is like an icon here. So an icon here, similar for this, which this might be seen as the another icon. Here we have now is the other section, all right. Where here we have now is the what's gonna call it here, the menu. All right, or the menu items. The menu items. All right, which is the menu items. And inside of here you have now is the icon, where this not only going to show is an icon, but also is reuse perhaps some logics inside of that. So we can say that here, all right, all of this will be wrapped into something called as the menu, right? Or you can call this as the header, right? So this is our header. Now right below the header, we're going to show now is this, where as you can see is like a selection of categories. I say categories of this, which is great, right? And here, as you can see, well, you now see that this will be is the some sort of content, okay, like content. Where inside of the content we want to show now is let's say this is some sort of, here we can have now is, let's say is the article here, the content, where we say is the main content, right? Main content, right? You can call it that, or you can call it that as an article, right? The header show, or the hero section here, where inside of this hero section you will have is now this layout divided this way to show now is some sort of content here, or just like that, but you can have is another component here where you're going to have that will show is this, you can call this like a form submit to business and work, right? You can call this business and work form, right? And inside of this, you will have now like a list. This will be now a list. And inside of this is the list item. All right, so the list item. Where all of this will be now a list item. Each one of them will be is a list item. All of them will be a list item. And this will be now the button. Finally, we look a button after all. So here we can have is now this is the icon, you know, as well as the another icon and some other icon. But you can see here is what actually is doing React when it's creating all of these components, right? So here you're gonna show is the icon, right? Some badge here. I'm gonna say now badge. An insignia, top contributor, and then you can have now a list, right? You have now a list where each one of them will be now an icon, so on and so forth, you know. All of them will be an icon, an icon, an icon, an icon, an icon, right? And then, well, now your layout to render the image. We can call this as gallery, right? We say gallery. And this gallery is going to use this to render this, right? So once I submit this, and this may be quite a little bit complex.
So this is a web application called Unsplash. And full disclosure, I used to work on this team, only for a few months, but it was really fun and a really satisfying place to work. The idea is it's a community for photographers to share their beautifully taken photos, and people who maybe they're marketers or just website owners who need beautiful stock photography to find a place for generously licensed and free photos. And when I look at this page, my brain sort of automatically segments it into two bits. We have the header, which is everything up here, and then we have the view, right? The route that the person is currently on. Because I imagine as they click through the different categories or even to the different links on the page, the header is going to stay consistent, other than, you know, updating to show the active link. But one of the fun things is which component to render, and more about routing later in the course. We search here and create our first menu. And I'm doing that because I'm not just creating the component for this little icon, right? If I was on, I'm not on this component, we have this, so I'm going to choose one, because there are some subtle things, like there's different styles for the currently active page. There's the featured flag, which is kind of an optional thing. I don't have the patience to draw boxes around each one of these, so I'm going to call this category nav item, and I'm going to do like the first 3 or 4, and then we're going to use, but ultimately the artifact, as long as we've sort of made it as clear, and I hope you didn't spend 5 minutes drawing each box around each category summary. So I'm going to call this breakdown table, and I'm not making it, well, this little table is kind of a neat little story summary. And within that, well, this little table is kind of a neat little thing. That's probably its own component. So I'm going to call this breakdown table. And I'm not making it like category breakdown table because maybe there's other places beyond the category page that I need this sort of like key value display where we have various attributes, and again, we might use their avatars, right? We're found them, and I'm going to call this avatar group. Another one of those. And then the main thing left is our grid of photos. So I'm going to drag a box around all of this. I'm going to call it photo grid. In terms of whether every image in this grid should be its own component, based on this mockup, I could see an argument either way, but I have insider knowledge, right? Having worked there and used the product, I know that each of these photos has a bunch of stuff that only shows up on hover. And so for me, it makes sense to create a component so that I can bundle all of these various things. So I'm going to draw a box around the first one, and I'm going to call it photo grid item. And once again, I'm going to drag boxes around the other ones, but I'm going to be a little bit lazy, and I'm going to do it around the 3 that are fully visible and not the 2 that are sort of hinted at. And with that, with these components, I think we can mark this one as complete.
Okay, so there is one header that is going to have now the search bar, the icon, and the hamburger. Okay, which is great. The category it goes through. The category here, followed by exactly. You don't need all of this. That's quite interesting. You only have the category, the business and work form, or the category form, where the only component that you want to create is this avatar. That's mind-blowing, bro. And now we have basic syntax. Basic syntax, props, children props, and exercise. Basic syntax. I'll throw enough high-level ideas. Let's look at some code. Exactly. And what's happening here is that anytime that it evaluates this, when it finds out a function, it's going to convert this into a React element behind the scenes, the JSX. JSX is going to convert, because it also has something that React is doing behind the scenes. So when you have React here, it's going to evaluate that, and also when it finds any of this JSX, it's going to convert that into React element, into a JavaScript code of that shape. In React, components are defined as JavaScript functions, and they can also be defined using a class keyword. Through this is considered a legacy alternative that isn't recommended in modern React applications. Typically, React component returns one or more React elements. This component, friendly greetings, create a React element that describes a paragraph with some built-in styles. For simplicity, we're using inline style here. We'll talk more about React-ish or React-rich style and code ecosystem in an upcoming lesson. And the styling. Okay. Styling in React. React is an opinionated when it comes to styling. As a result, there are dozens of options out there when it comes to pairing CSS with React. Technically, there is nothing to stop you from doing things like the traditional way. You could keep your bunch of CSS and include them with a link, an index, but only if you want to have a best experience building with React. There are better approach of this. The core idea with component is that exactly you keep them around.
So let's suppose you've just been hired by Amazon as a front-end developer, and the first thing they want you to do is apply some sort of styling tweak to the navigation over here. So, you load it up in your browser and you go to check out the CSS, and my goodness, there is a lot of CSS that applies here. And, this is pretty typical for legacy sites, or really any site that uses traditional CSS styling methods that has been around for a while. Because what winds up happening is, at some point, you're working on this thing and you're in a different part of the code base, and you need to apply an override to the styles that already exist. And if you already have this big selector as the thing applying styles and you have to overwrite it, right? You need to set a new margin for it. Well, you need to put an even larger selector, right? One that's even more specific. And so you wind up with this like arms race where it's like ever incrementing selectors. And it just makes it really, really hard to understand what styles apply to a given element. Like if you're looking at the HTML and you see that you have this anchor text, there's not even a class name on this. Or no, there is, nav A. But like it is really hard based on the markup to figure out where the different styles could be coming from because there's so many different places. Anywhere in the application can write a selector to style this particular nav link. Now, this isn't really a new problem. People have been coming up with solutions to this problem since long before React even existed, and one of the most popular solutions is called BEM. BEM stands for Block Elephant.
Exactly.
Block Element modifier.
Block element.
And we'll take a quick look at an example. We have this search form class, right? And so the idea is we've created a block. We've created this search form is now going to be
this
named
way
search
of
form.
how do we
And the individual
organize now,
elements within that will have this suffix.
styles.
This is nice things because but it's not without its downsides. And the biggest downside in my mind to BEM is that the onus is on the developer, right? I have to remember to follow these sets of rules. So it requires like an incredible amount of vigilance and discipline because every time you want to style something, you have to remember to follow the formula. And knowing what I know about human nature, it is not simple to keep this going on a large team over time. People are going to get lazy, they're going to forget, they're going to write their own styles in their own way, and then the whole system kind of blows up. The other thing that's tricky about this is that every time you create a new block, it has to be a globally unique name. And that's probably easy at first, but eventually you're going to have 17 search forms on different parts of the thing, and they all have to have their own unique name. So you wind up with these really long compound names, like search form logged out homepage footer. And it just becomes a pain to work with when you have to repeat that long name for every element and every modifier. Essentially, BEM works well on small projects, but in my opinion, it doesn't really scale super well across larger projects or larger teams. And so when React started gaining popularity, people started getting even more creative with the solutions. Like, what if we could have this sort of system, but it could be done automatically, so that the developer doesn't have to do anything. It just sort of happens on its own. And people have come up with all kinds of solutions, right? There's style components, emotion, vanilla extract, stitches. There's so many different implementations, but most of them solve the problem in a similar way in terms of automatic scoping. And it's a wonderful thing. It's so, so nice when we work with a CSS solution where we never have to worry about any of these problems. We can just write small, simple selectors and trust that those styles will be scoped to their component. And what it means is that even as the project gets bigger and bigger, you never have to hunt around the application to figure out where the styles live.
Especially because
so I realize this is all very abstract. In the next lesson, we're going to look at an implementation using one of these tools, so you can see for yourself how nice it is.
For legacy apps, bro. For legacy apps, bro. Exactly. CSS models and all like that kind of stuff. But again, go back to the basic syntax here and how you're going to do this. So this component friendly greetings creates a React element that describes a paragraph, and this narrative is important. So this friendly greetings is creating now a React component or React element that describe a paragraph with some built-in style and content. For simplicity, we're using inline style here, and we'll talk more about the React rich ecosystems in an upcoming lesson. We render a component the same way we render an HTML tag. Instead of rendering a div or an h1, we render a friendly greeting. But this component, friendly greetings, creates now a React element that describes the paragraph and some styles followed by the content. All right. This is the way of how you started to describe this. So anytime you're starting to read here, you see what is the metadata that is talking about, or what is the story that is telling you this here. Besides that, understanding is the JavaScript, but what is the React lecture or React reading from this? It's like, hey, I'm going to create now a React element that describe is a paragraph with these attributes followed by the children's, in our case only the content. Let's take a look. Let's do this. Let's do this because I think this is something that is valuable. Absolutely. 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 It is something that is valuable indeed. Is this, bro? Thinking in components, and here we're going to look at the basic syntax. So basic syntax. All right, thinking in component exercise. You got one, and you got another one. Right, thinking in components. Can I? No, right? I can undo that S. Well, anyway. So he wrote that? and book workspace instantly. Browse and book workspace instantly. Exactly. What is the business model of this? What is the business model of this? Exactly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Hmm. Exactly, because they're working on that. Yeah, it's another. Internal communication manager and senior people partner. The MBA, bro. The MBAs need to be done, bro. The MBAs need to be done. Anyway, good for you, fella. Good for you, boy. So this is the basic syntax, right? This. So basic syntax. Now that we did this, the basic syntax, with exploring this, seems like a crash. So here in the code, so here friendly greeting is creating a React element that describe. Interesting. So here we're doing this kind of description here, this narrative is important to describe here. So here friendly greeting is creating a React element that describe a paragraph and some styles associate with it. All right, a paragraph and some style associate with it. So for simplicity, we are using inline styles, but this is something that is not used in production in React development teams. Okay, or in production, in React production, since it involves exactly. So we're going to see that later on. But for now, what we care is this: we render a component the same way we render an HTML tag. Instead of rendering an a div or an h1, we render it friendly greeting. Okay, we are rendering its friendly greeting. So instead of rendering a div or an AIF like this, so instead of rendering a div or an h1, we render a friendly greeting. Arrow functions versus traditional functions. Modern JavaScript supports two different syntax for writing functions. In addition to the traditional way using the function keyword, you can also use arrow functions. If you're not familiar with arrow function, check out this JavaScript primer lesson arrow. Which sort of function should be used defining React component? The short answer, it doesn't matter. There are some functional limitations when it comes to the arrow function, like not having their own this value and not being constructor friendly. And when it comes to React component, none of these limitations are relevant. Arrow functions work just as well as traditional functions. Personally, I prefer to use a function for my React component. It seems a bit more common, but it honestly doesn't make any difference. I prefer to use the function definition here because during debugging, you can see the name of the function, right? I'll prefer to use name function due to debugging reasons. So in the stack trace, I can see the name of the function when something goes wrong at that function, right? That's one of the reasons why I prefer to go with the big component rule like this. There aren't a ton of rules when it comes to creating components, but there is an ironclad one. The React component needs to start with a capital letter. Yeah, pretty much like this, right? The big component rule. The big component rule. So all name component must start with exactly. Name component must start with uppercase or with capital letter. Need to start with capital letter. It must start with capital letters, right? There you go. So for example, something like this. A React element is a description of a thing we want to create. In some cases, we want to create a DOM node like an H1 or a P. In other cases, we want to create a component instance. The first argument that we want to pass is the type. All right, whether it's a component instance or a node. So, why it is based on the character casing? At first glance, this whole rule feels a bit unnecessary. Surely, React can tell whether we are trying to render an HTML tag or a component, and there is only so many built-in HTML tags, right? Sadly, things aren't quite as straightforward as they seem. Let's pretend the capital letter rule didn't exist, and that we have the following JSX snippet. Should this compile to built-in button? So for example, what should this compile to the built-in button HTML tag, or has the user created a component called button? Plenty of the component library have a button component after all. Well, maybe we could have a new rules. Component can share names with HTML tags. What the French though? Okay. Should this compile to the built-in button HTML tag? Or has the user created a component called button? Plenty of the component library we have a button. Plenty of the component library have a button component. Well, maybe we could have a new rule. Component can share name with HTML tag. React could have a big list of all built-in HTML tags, and they are be considered reserved word. That sounds alright, except for the fact that every now and then we get the new HTML tag. The list of HTML tag isn't a set in stone. Think about how many React applications will break if the W3C decide next year to create a new carousel tag. Holy fuck. Ultimately, I think using the character case makes a lot of sense. It gives us a way to quickly identify whether a particular element is a building HTML tag or a custom component. Alright? So, why is this? Why is this? Imagine suddenly the W3C decide to create a component, an HTML tag called carousel. How many React apps in the world will be affected by this? You can break a large portion of the internet. You know, if you do that, a large portion of the internet, if you do that. So this is the basic syntax. Then we got now the props. So far our friendly greeting component is kind of cool, but it isn't terribly useful. Every time we render friendly, we get exactly the same result. It isn't flexible at all. And thankfully, components have a thing called props, and props are like arguments to a function. Exactly. They allow us to pass data to our components so that the component can include customization based on data. When I taught React at a local coding boot camp, props were a common stumbling block. It can take a while the concept to click. If you feel discouraged for not getting it right away, please know that this is normal. It is normal to feel that way, and you can always ask questions in our community discourse. Alright, so let's suppose we want to tweak our greetings to take personal names so that can greet them.
So our goal is to update the friendly greeting component so that it greets the person by name. And we've seen how to do some of this, right? Like if I have a name variable, then we can create an expression slot. I can wrap it in squiggly brackets, and it will evaluate this variable. And that way, if name is equal to Josh, it'll say greetings Josh, right? That's the trick that we want to use. But we haven't yet seen, how do I funnel data into the component? How do I give friendly greeting that information? And the kind of cool thing is that React piggybacks on the pattern that you're probably already familiar with when it comes to giving data to HTML elements. So if we look, we have this div down here. And if I wanted this div to have a specific ID, I would say ID equals some div. And that essentially is the syntax for passing data to an HTML element. Well, we do the exact same thing when it comes to React components. And what I'm going to say is name is equal to Josh. When I do that, essentially what React does as it's rendering is it collects all of the data that I've specified this way, and it provides it to the component by calling this function with that data. So we're going to give it a props object, and essentially props is now going to be an object where it has a name property set to the value of Josh. And so in my actual code, I can say props.name, and we see that our output is rectified, and everything seems nice and good. And the cool thing about this is now our formerly static component can be used to handle a dynamic number of situations. So I can create another one, but change the name to Anita or Rahul. And now we see that each of these elements, they're all using the same component, but we're specifying different data for each one. I should say too, you won't often see React components written like this in the wild. us React developers, we really like taking advantage of like bleeding edge JavaScript features, and one of the modern JavaScript things that people really like is called destructuring. If you're not familiar with destructuring, there's going to be a link under this video that links to the bonus lesson on the topic. But essentially how it works is we can extract the data from this object right in the function declaration. So I'm going to replace this with the curly brackets for an object, and I'm going to specify name, and then I don't need the props dot. I can just specify name like this. I think people like doing this for a couple reasons. One is it's just less typing. You don't have to type props dot whatever. But there's another advantage too, which is, let's say this component had like 5 or 6 properties. Like maybe it has age and location and class name. By doing it this way, we see right at the very top what all of the different properties are. We don't have to go hunting within the definition of the function itself. We can see right up top what all of the different data is, which is useful sometimes. So that's how we specify props, right? We use the HTML syntax on the React element, then we destructure the props object, and then we use that data in our component. But how is this actually working? Like I think so often with React, we sort of just accept that it's magical. But I think it's helpful to see how this data actually gets from place to place. So what I want to do is I want to make things a little bit simpler. I'm going to get rid of everything but a single React element. And I want to go through the steps and see how React actually goes about taking this information and passing it to this function. And the first thing we should do is transpile away this JSX. So I'm going to replace it with React.createElement.
Is to actually describe how is the process is working. Good. I really love about this dissection aspect here. This dissection aspect
element. And I want to go through the steps and see how React actually goes about taking this information and passing it to this function. And the first thing we should do is transpile away this JSX. So I'm going to replace it with React.createElement. When I do this, I have to actually import React since we're specifying it explicitly now. So import React from React. And for the create element call, I need to pass it the type of the element, which is going to be our friendly greeting component. Friendly reminder that if this was an HTML element, like a button or a div, we would specify it as a string. But because we have our own custom component, we specify a function reference here. And then the second thing I need to pass it is the data, right? The props. And so I'm going to create an object. I'm going to set name equal to Josh. And when I do this, we have restored rendering, right? Essentially, this is the compiled version of this. They're exactly the same. This is just so we can see what it looks like in pure JavaScript. But let's go one step even further, right? What does this function call do? So I'm going to take this function call out. I'm going to say const element is equal to all of that stuff. And then I'm going to pass the element in over here. Then I'm going to console log element. And if I pop open the console, and we ignore the plethora of errors that have crept up in there, what we see is this React element, right? It's a JavaScript object, as we talked about.
Exactly. What we see here is a React element, which is this JavaScript object, and look at it, that is using now a symbol, all right, the dollar type of, and it has now this, okay, interesting. So it says that this is a type of. Again, where console log is the element here, which is the output that the React create element actually does. And as you can see, it's a simple JavaScript object that has a type of, all right. It has now a key. It has a property called props. It has a ref. It has a type. It has some private inner methods like owner and store.
It has a bunch of
self-source and the prototype. So this is good because here we are looking is what this element is getting rendered. So when we invoke
information that I don't understand, that you shouldn't have to understand, but there's two things I want to draw your attention to. The first is the type of this object has the friendly greeting function. So we're saying that this element is of type friendly greeting. And we also see that we have this props object. And we take this element, right, this bundle of information about this particular element, and we pass it on to the render function, right? We're telling React, hey, this is a React element, render it. And by render, what we mean is figure out what it is and actually put it into the DOM, right? Like make it so. And so what React is going to do is it's going to say, this is a friendly greeting component. Because it's a component, it's a function, I have to call that function, and I'm going to call it with the props that have been provided. So React is going to call this function, it's going to give it this information, that's how this props object is populated, right? That's how the argument is provided. And then it's going to take whatever is output and use that information to render the page. So it's going to say, hey, friendly greeting, here's the person's name, do whatever you want with that, and then whatever you return, I'm going to put into the DOM. I know that it is like... I don't know that this is clarifying. I hope that it is. I do recognize that React is a complicated tool, and we are going much deeper than most tutorials, most courses will go. But I do think that it is useful just to see a little bit how this stuff works under the hood. So hopefully it's helpful. If it's not, like if you're still feeling like this is way over your head, please don't worry. We're going to have much more opportunity to learn about React in this course. The important thing for now is that you understand that passing name equals Josh in the JSX like this will produce that information in the component.
Exactly, but behind the scenes, what it's doing is creating this. So you are calling to React to create this element that instead of producing is an HTML tag, which is doing with document.create. What it does is to create an object. And inside of that object, it has some additional information that is relevant to React to render. But I want to draw that attention into these two properties here. The type, where now it holds the function that describe how the element is going to look like, all right, and how it's going to render. And the other is the props. What are the props that this component is needed? Okay, so by the time that the render function now call these objects, which is interesting, so it is a bunch of objects here. Once React does that, well, now we can see for sure that is using this object information internally to then now render that properly into the DOM. Holy moly, bro. So the way to describe this is very, very, very important. This video was filmed using React 17, but this code has been updated for React 19. React 17, bro. Very, very, very interesting. Has been updated for React 19. So what it's doing is like this. So render is going to transform, is going to transpile this. Is he find any tag that is now a React component, as it is going to now create that or transpile that into a JavaScript, particularly the React element here. All right, so what it's doing is doing this. It's gonna transpile this into a React element, React.createElement, where the first is the friendly greeting. All right, we're not passing anything here, but as you can see, it's not going to render that because this is quite different. This is not rendering the way how.
So our goal is to update under the hood, and I'm going as we have our own custom.
This is not being rendered the way that is rendered. Okay, so in other words, what we can say here is this. The second argument is the props, which is the name. And here we are saying, hey, the name of this will be I don't know what's the name of this previously. Anita. And the content of that, which is exactly just like that. All right. And since we are now using this, exactly, since we are using now this particular way to render this element, not we're using it's a JSX way to render elements here. All right. So it means that we are not able to do this unless you use now the React done, let's say the render method, which is an object here. Oh, if this is an object, must be here, must be like this. But it's using the React DOM. The render and then the document query selector root. And then the document query selector root. Exactly. But this won't work. This won't work because you are using is now that particular version of that. Exactly. You are now using that particular version of that. Document query selector root with the render function from that. This video was filmed, but it said this: React.create is not a function. React.create root is not a function. Oh well, let's go to comment that out here. I don't need this. Calling the render here, then stack framework collapse. It's not a function. But again, that's quite interesting here. It's going to convert that, and I think that's important to know here. That's way important to know here, to understand that. Let's suppose we're working on our friendly greeting component. We want to greet the user, but there is a problem. We don't know everyone's name. I ran into this example problem when I was building a tool to generate newsletter issue. I didn't know the name of every subscriber. If I didn't know their name, I wanted to render a fallback value. You can either use that, we could do this in React with the O operators to render default values, or in like this, or even better this way. There are a couple of benefits to this approach. If we have multiple props with default values, we can see all the defaults in the same place. rather than having to sprinkle it around the component. The default value is logged in. We don't have to remember all the fallback checks everywhere we reference the name props. The double operator will occasionally surprise us by using the default value even when we are supplying a value. This can happen when supply falsy, for example. As a result, it becomes a well-established convention to especially default values within a props object here. Here's another example. We have decorate horizontal rules. Component essentially a way to draw a line between sections. It has a default width of 100. The nullish collision operator, exactly. Another option for setting fallback's value is with the nullish collision operator. This is the reason why it was created. It's because it's to solve these specific problems, the React problems. If you haven't seen this curious fellas, it's very similar to OR, but with only guards against nullish values. It means we don't have to worry about surprising falsy like 0. Ultimately, though, I prefer to use the default values approach when it comes to React props. I like being able to see fallback's value all in one place and to make sure that the same fallback value is being used consistently whenever the prop is referenced. You can learn more about this operator on my JavaScript operator lookup tool. What the French stuff is this? Oh, the lookup operator. Ah, that's interesting. Oh, okay. Nullish collision. Operator lookup. The ternary operator. The logical not. And then it's gonna show you is this one. That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. React in JavaScript. Mm-hmm. That's interesting, and it's showing that counter. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. That's very, very interesting. That's very, 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 very interesting, by the way. Okay. Hmm. And the children props. Now we get why we are passing is the children props, bro. Let's suppose that we are building a custom button. It should look and act just like a regular HTML, but it should have a red background and white text. We could write it like this here and render the content, and then we had use it like this. So render the button. So what it's gonna do is the render function is going to convert that or transpile that into a JavaScript code, the React element that describes the tag, which is in this case the button, as well as the style, all right, and some props that we're passing here, that we expect to pass here, like this, followed by the last prop, which is the content or the children. This works, but it feels a bit funny, doesn't it? It is quite different for how we use the typical HTML button, where the content goes in between the open and close tag. It is a nice bit of syntactic sugar, which is a way of producing the same result with a sweetener API. Generally, sometimes it makes the code a bit nicer to work with. React let us do the same thing with our custom component, like this. When we do this, we can access the children through the children props. This is a quality of life things that React does for us. When we pass something between the open and the close tag, React will automatically supply the value to us under children. So it will automatically supply the value under us with children. And we can see this when we examine a React element produced by this, right? So when we look at this, the element that React is produced is with the type, with the key, with the props, followed by the children property that will contain the content. Okay, so this is pretty much like we say, because this is the JSX, so this will be transformed. Okay, we say, hey, cons element cons the React element, okay, to say, all right, let me now create is the React element, create element, okay, React create element with this tag followed by the properties, all right, in this case is nothing, and the content that I want you to render, which is the hello world. This is the same, right? And if we do something like this, we clean that up, and this is exactly the same, right? So this JSX or create elements is the same like this. So we can see we examine the React element to produce this. Children is an special value, a reserved word when it comes to props. But it is not that special. I think a lot of you come to React think that children is somehow distinct and different from other props. In fact, it is exactly the same. If we want to, we could pass children in the traditional way. It is clunky, but the outcome is the same, right? This element, what the fuck? Also, we're giving a special bit of syntax. That element will work that way? I don't believe you. What? This element is equivalent to this one. And so we're giving a special bit of syntax to make JSX more like HTML. But fundamentally, the children prop is the same as any other prop. There is nothing special or magical here. So the children, but I don't think the children is something like this. You can do that, right? So when you create an element, you say element 1, and then you say document dot create element. Let's say this is now a div. All right, and when you try to access to this element, do you have now children property? Holy fuck! Do you have children property? And if you do this, and then you say, hey, the children of this, which will be the content, is the now, well, here, let's say, hello world. All right, and when you try to render that element, by saying text content is nothing, but the children is this hello world stuff. So element 1, we're gonna render as this div. But they have now the children elements. Holy French toast. So for example, if I do this, let me actually put that at test here and say now things like, hey, if I say children, that'll be is now hello world. So that's a property of the HTML element. And so we're giving a special bit of syntax to make JSX feel more like HTML. But fundamentally, the children prop is the same as any other props. There is nothing special or magical about it. What happens if we pass both forms and the children props? Well, let's take a look. What happens if we pass both children as an attribute between the brackets? Let's take a look. If it appears that React choose to prioritize the children pass in between the open close tag, this seems like the right call to me. So for example, if you pass this as an attribute, holy fuck, if you pass something between the brackets, this seems like the right call to me, since there is the more conventional way to set an element children here. Some student has wondered, was this an intentional design chosen by the React teams, or it is more that a children's props get merged together? And the second one wins. And the second one wins? Well, let's consider the compile JS to look like this. Okay, so this will look like exactly, and between the brackets we see they are passed to the createElement function as two different arguments. This strongly suggests to me that React team made an intentional decisions to manually override the children value in the props object with the children argument supplied afterwards. Holy moly. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.